I've got it.
Yes.
That's meg squared.
Yeah.
So I welcome you. Very, very happy that you're here. You will have a very interesting day. I first met Dr. David Lindquist probably 13, 14 years ago when he was a teacher at Snyder High School, and I was in like a docent workshop about the Anne Frank exhibit. So if any of you work on the Anne Frank book, any of your classes, or you have students that want to do that, you have an expert here. Okay, he can definitely give you materials or information or tell you where to go with that. That being said, we hope all of you have, good questions, and David is the person to answer them. We would like to stay in contact with you if you would like to stay in contact with us. All of you have my card, it has my email address. The problem is that if I email you in many of your school systems, I go to junk mail. I know that's an impossible thought that I would go to junk mail, right? But I do. So it's often good if you have a question or you would like to stay connected with the Jewish Federation, you would like to help us, ask us to help you provide materials for your classroom. We have a couple of teachers here that we have worked with that this is one of our purposes, is to do that. So to make sure that we can stay connected, if you want to email me, then that gives me the opportunity to answer you and I don't go to junk mail, okay? But it's completely voluntary. So I'm simply going to pass around just a sign-up sheet to give you your names and your email addresses. Again, we're here the whole day if you have any questions or thoughts or concerns, but I welcome you all, and I'm impressed. You guys were like here before 7:30. That is like so impressive. Thank you, and welcome Dr. David Lindquist.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We know how hard it is to get away, and then also hard it is to get back, which may be the bigger issue sometimes, but thank you for being here. I want to begin by introducing a few people. Where's Lee?
Over here.
There, look. First, Dr. Lee Roberts. Lee is Associate Professor of German at IPFW, soon to be PFW. We won't get into that one this morning. Lee is co-director of the Institute of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Steve Carr and I started that 8-9 years ago now. And when I retired, Lee became the associate or co-director of that, so he can help you. Dr. Patty Rhoda, who's also from the Institute. She's the, I don't know, Patty, what your exact title is now.
Education Outreach Coordinator.
For the Institute of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at IPFW, and she actually has an office like
Right
about
across
35 feet
Yeah.
from here. So anyway, Josh Grubaugh, back here. Josh teaches biology and sometimes English at New Haven High School. To give you a little background here, one of his co-teachers, Aaron White, who could not be here today, was working for us at IPFW a couple summers ago, or several summers ago now. And I had her in class when she was getting her license. And she got interested in Holocaust and said, I'm a biology teacher, what can I do with that? So we kind of cooked together a program in genetics. It's become very, very interesting. And she's actually done either, I think, 3 now overseas programs to Holocaust sites in Europe. And Josh has kind of gotten in with her on that, and they're right now working on a capstone course for East Allen, hopefully for a year from now. So Josh has some pretty good background, and please avail of with him today. Jeff Roberts right up here. Jeff is at Wayne New Tech High School. When I was teaching a summer course on Holocaust education, gosh, Jeff, 2003, 2004,
yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, it's 2002.
Something like that back there. Took that course and we've become good friends since, and he's done a lot at Wayne New Tech, which with the program learning and so forth. And we have a little bit of time, maybe at lunch, Jeff can talk about that. So he has a lot of background as well in terms of Holocaust education and particularly project-based Holocaust education. Aaron, as I said, could not be here today. There are 2 museum teacher fellows in the area who could not be here today. Ashley Libben from West Noble Middle could not be here today, and Tiffany Hanley from Snyder could not be here today. They're both museum teacher fellows, and again, we can give you their contact information as well. So anyway, welcome, and again, those folks to can help out and pitch in and so forth as we go along. Lee actually teaches some courses on occasion in sort of Holocaust-related topics within the German department at IPFW on sort of every other year basis or something, like kind of alternates a little bit.
It's been almost every year for a while.
Yeah. And also Ann Lifshitz teaches on occasion a history course in Holocaust at IPFW. I'd like to thank Congregation Active Shalom for this use of this center. Just opened back in May after a lot of planning, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful facility. And I want to thank everybody here. Clint for getting us set up today, Bonnie down there for doing all the administrative work, and Jackie, of course, for her efforts. Betsy Gephardt, who is the director of the center here, the resource center, particularly the library, will be with us later on and talk a little bit about just some of the resources that are available. Jackie, you want to talk a little bit about the substitute reimbursement and who's funding that, please?
Yes. Because unlike you, I'm not used to getting up this early, so I forgot to mention that. And make sure that we have all of your substitute reimbursement forms. As you know, and hopefully you know in the materials we sent to you, that the Jewish Federation will take care of your substitute for allowing you to be here today. So if you have not turned those forms in, please make sure that I get them.
The 3-ring binders you have are alphabetized. I will tell you right off the top, most of the things that are in those binders we will not be using today. There will be some things we'll be using, but there's just a whole lot of resources in there that we hope you find useful. Some of them are things that I've created, some of them are things that I've taken off the website of the Holocaust Museum and a couple of other websites. Again, the ones we will be using, we'll get to along the way, but just a whole lot of things that we hope can be helpful to you in there. If you've had a chance to look at them, there's one in there about what students should have studied before they begin looking at the Holocaust. It's a very important topic, and it seems almost obvious, and yet sometimes people will not do that. Use of oral history, which we'll be talking about. And so, again, it's alphabetized, and there are some things we're going to add to it. We intentionally did not put 3 documents in there because the first exercise we're going to do today will deal with those. And you know, the other thing was, if you want somebody to do them, tell them not to look at it. So we didn't put them in there, so we'll get to them in a little while. There are 2 things in there that are not Holocaust related at all. Actually, the first couple of things, the Bloom's taxonomy chart and the Common Core vocabulary list. And I know that Common Core is sort of whatever it is right now, but if you look at that list on there, I think it's really a good list of vocabulary terms. There was a study done several years ago now about Common Core vocabulary and when various Common Core vocabulary verbs, action verbs were introduced. And I thought it would just be interesting people to have that, and obviously you can use that for teaching anything. And also the Bloom's taxonomy chart, because one of the things we really try to emphasize today is the complexity of the subject, also the complexity of teaching the subject, and how you can use vocabulary to really get kids into higher order thinking in that. And I think those 2 documents should help you on that. Not again just for Holocaust, but for anything. A couple of other administrative things. Feel free to get coffee or tea or water, whatever you want to. Jackie will have me keep saying that during the day, so I'll say it right now again. Feel free to do so. If you need to use the restrooms, they're right out in the hallway to the right. Please don't go past the double doors. That's the preschool area, and there's some security regulations, so please don't go past there. Whenever I use the term museum, I'll be referring to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. unless otherwise noted, and we'll go through these here in just a minute. One of the things we're going to try to do is to have you do a lot of activities, several activities anyway, that I think would work very well with your students. I'm not going to stand up here and lecture on Holocaust history. That would not be effective in any way, in shape, or form. But we're going to have you do some things. For example, the first thing we're going to do here in just a few minutes will be to have you define the Holocaust, build your own personal definition of the Holocaust. And this is an activity that I always use, and I think it's a very effective activity to use with students as well. Most importantly, feel free to walk around, switch tables if you want to. please don't hesitate to ask questions. If you're not sure about something in terms of an historical point, a teaching point, whatever it happens to be, please don't hesitate to ask. We've tried to build enough time into the schedule for each particular segment of the schedule to allow for a lot of that, and that's obviously, as you all know from teaching, that's sort of an iffy kind of thing. You know, how much time does this take? How much time does that take? So anyway, anything else? One more introduction. I should have. Carol Jackson is right over here. Carol is on the Yom HaShoah committee and has become very active in that in the last few years. And Carol, welcome again today. I think I saw you at the Reformation concert the other night. I thought I saw you out there. Okay. The first thing we'd like to do then, if you look in your notebook, and again it's alphabetized, there's a document in there called Seminar Overview. If you dig that out, it'll be back towards the end of your notebook. I'd just like to kind of go over sort of our focal points today, and so forth and so on, to get us started. Seminar Overview. You got it okay? We got it? Couple things on here. The first two things really on here, again, are not Holocaust specific, but I like to start with them as sort of an introduction to just a general approach and so forth and so on. And then we'll get into more Holocaust-specific stuff. And the first thing, there are 4 vital questions for consideration. It's always interesting when I was teaching IPFW and doing the social studies and English methods, I would usually start the course with, I would simply say to the student, the pre-service people getting ready to student teach, what are the 4 questions that we ask for any educational experience? And none of them ever got it. Not one student ever picked it out. But if you look at them, it's kind of a flowchart kind of thing. What do we want students to know or be able to do? And the thing I think is interesting about this, and again, this is not Holocaust specific, but I think it's a good starting point for us here. Regardless of the educational setting, teaching Holocaust, teaching biology, teaching somebody how to hold a golf club, in any educational setting, the first thing we need to ask is, what do we want students to know when they finish, or what do we want students to be able to do when they finish? And the reason I think this is a tricky question is we sometimes sort of jump into a subject not knowing where we're going to go. If any of you have heard the term backward planning, which is a big educational term. You know, a lot of times, particularly I think in history, and I mainly taught history when I was in high school, you start at the beginning of the book and you go as far as you can go, and you never get to the end. And so this idea of what do we want students to know at the end? So when you start your Holocaust unit or any unit, you really need to say, this is what we want to know at the end of the unit. The second question, how do we know if they've learned it? In a physical skill, that's pretty obvious. Can they do the physical skill? In some subjects, it's pretty obvious. If you're teaching quadratics at the end of a unit, what should they be able to do? A quadratic. In history, English, and so forth, that may not be as obvious. And then the next two, what do we do if they've learned it? What do we do if they haven't learned it? And again, I know these are obvious once you list them, but a lot of times people don't get them. And think back to your own experiences. This may be a bad one for some of you if you don't like math, but think back to your own experiences in math in high school. And on Friday you took the Chapter 6 test, and on Monday the teacher says, all of you did badly on the Chapter 6 test, we're going to begin Chapter 7 tomorrow. There's a lack of logic in that. So I really think these are some things that you can really think about when you're any educational setting. And then the 3 essential questions, and this is really what we're going to be looking at today. What content? What pedagogy? General pedagogy, general teaching things, and then content-specific pedagogy. And that third one there is really what we're going to be talking about today. How do you teach this subject? And at the top of the thing, that little paragraph that we have there, I think is a very important thing for us to understand. If I were to stand up here today and give you 3 or 4 very detailed lectures on the history of the Holocaust, we would fail in our goal today for a couple of reasons. Number one is we all know lecture is not a very good way to do it. But beyond that, there is no way to teach the history of the Holocaust. The subject is simply too big. It's big in terms of its scope. It's also big in terms of the information. The Holocaust is the most documented single event in history. And one of the things that makes that documentation so fascinating, and I think so difficult with which to work, is the fact that who did most of the documentation? The perpetrators. Now think about that. Usually when we think about studying history, we think about looking at documents that, primary sources that come out of the history. In this case, the primary sources, the great majority of the primary sources, are the documents created by the perpetrators. At the end of the war, there was this massive, massive effort by the SS and the other agencies within the government, the Nazi regime, to destroy documentation. Given what is left, the millions of documents that are still available, we can only imagine how many millions times more documents there were. And I think, therefore, to try to cover that in a day, in a course, in 10 courses, in 20 courses, really, really wouldn't work. So we're not going to talk about the history of the Holocaust. Having said that, we will talk about a lot of Holocaust history, and you'll go away with a lot of Holocaust content, but understand we are skimming the very, very top of the thing there. I think that's an important point to note. Now, in terms of specific content, in terms of giving you some place to start, the two books that Jackie's arranged for you to receive, I want to talk about those for just a minute if you take those out. The first one, the big one, The World Must Know. This is actually edition number 2. The original edition was published in 1993 when the museum opened. And then this is a newer edition. I forget what the copyright date on this is. And the intent here is to take you through Holocaust history as if you were walking through the museum in D.C. How many of you have been to the museum in D.C.? Good, quite a few. Good, great. So if you think back to your experiences in the museum, you get there, you take the elevator up to the 4th floor, you turn to the left, or when you come out of the elevator, there's that big picture of liberation of one of the camps in Germany. You kind of walk around and you start with Nazi rise to power, anti-Semitism, and so forth. And then as you work your way through the 4th floor, 3rd floor, 2nd floor, you go through all the various exhibits. The book is designed as if you were walking through the museum. So you're going to see the content is very similar. Many of the photographs are taken from the museum. In fact, I think almost all the photographs are taken from the permanent exhibit, the PE. And a lot of the text is actually taken from there. So I think this is a really good way that you can orient yourself in that regard. The second book, the smaller book, Doris Bergen's The Holocaust, A Concise History. This is the second edition of this book. You'll see it under a slightly different title in an earlier edition. Doris Bergen used to be at Notre Dame. She's now at the University of Toronto. I had the opportunity to hear her speak one time. The best single lecture I ever heard on Holocaust history was by Doris Bergen. I mean, she was just absolutely phenomenal. I wish I had it on tape. I mean, she was just so good. And the book, the strength of the book, I think, is the word concise. Again, if you start looking at Jeffy, you're very familiar with this book. You can look at some of the history texts on this, and they are 700-800 pages. This one's about 210, 215 pages, something like that. And the conciseness of it. The thing I think is really good about this book is it gives you a very solid overview of the history of the Holocaust, and also gives you a lot of very, very important, subtle implications. And the most important of those, or one of those examples, if you look at the first page of text, I think it's Roman numeral page 4 or something like that, she makes a comment in there, right at the bottom of that page. It says, without World War II, the Holocaust didn't happen, could not have happened, would not have happened, could not have happened. And I think that's an example of what you'll find in this book, these subtle implications. When she says, essentially, no war, no Holocaust, it's a very important point to note. Because the Holocaust has to be contextualized within the framework of World War II. One of the things we all know as history teachers is you have to contextualize things. It makes no sense to talk about Gettysburg if you're not talking about the Civil War. Well, in that sense, the Holocaust has to always be framed within the context of the flow, the evolution, the pattern of World War II. And sometimes teachers forget that. I remember one time talking with a teacher, and this particular teacher, very, very good teacher, was going to teach Holocaust for the first time. And she said, what should I do? And I gave her some suggestions, and I said, go at it and see what happens. And she came back a few weeks later, and she said, Dave, she said, it's just not working. And I said, well, tell me why. Tell me what, da-da-da-da-da. And I finally said, well, I won't use her name, Susie, that wasn't her name. I said, well, Susie, I said, when did you cover this in your World War II unit? And she said, oh, we're doing World War II next. And I said, that's your problem. I said, you always have to contextualize this within the framework of World War II. For example, the first mass murders occurred in the Soviet Union in 1941. Well, until the German army invades the Soviet Union, that can't happen. And so this idea of contextualization is critical, and I think that's what Bergen does so well here. So I think this is, as a short, quick reading text, it's absolutely the best. And I know, Jeff, you've been using it since you took the course 15, 16, that's a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot of quotes in there
Yeah.
that can be used to start the conversation with the students that she makes really, like she'll talk about timbers and ashes and things like that the kids all of a sudden start putting connections together. And I think the actual topics, the way that she lays them out, we bought the book at school, and that's the one we actually use, and we kind of pushed all the other books off to the side because she kind of lays it out in a shorter sense, so you're not trying to hit every single thing. But
And with freshmen and sophomores.
Yeah.
And it's very accessible to kids at that educational level as well. So anyway, I really urge you to read it. It's really good. There's a smattering of German terms in there where she explains how those terms have implications that don't necessarily translate into English and so forth and so on. Okay, goals for the seminar. I've laid out 8 things that we hope to do there. Basically, again, it's this idea of how to teach this subject, what to teach in this subject, and I think just as importantly, why to teach this subject. The question of rationale is an extremely important question in any educational setting, and it's, I think, particularly important one in this one. On the backside, recurring issues in Holocaust education. And I'd like to go through at least some of these in detail to kind of set our framework here. The first one, use of inappropriate pedagogical approaches. One of the things we know about Holocaust is that teachers sort of feel compelled to do something special with it. And I think that's maybe the nature of the subject, that's maybe the nature of students' interest in the subject, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. They somehow seem to think, gee, this is something special about this subject, and therefore we need to do something special. So you'll see people come up with all kinds of unique approaches. Probably, from my point of view, the most egregious one is the idea of simulations. The Anne Frank simulation, where kids have to wear the star and they have to go to the end of the line in the lunchroom. There was one a few years ago at a middle school in Florida where the kids at this middle school had not studied the Holocaust at all. But as they got off the bus one morning, the teachers would say, "You're a Jew, you're a guard, da-da-da," and they went through this whole day of this. And it was one of the kids was said, "What did you learn about this?" And he said, "I learned I'm glad I'm not a Jew." That's not an educational approach we want to use, simulations and so forth. There's a boxcar simulation that people do. It's interesting, when you talk to staff people at the museum, one of the things they always kind of laugh about is occasionally a staff member at the museum will get an email. "Can you tell me the dimensions of the boxcars?" Well, what the teacher's going to do is, they'll take some tape or something, they'll mark that off in their room, and then they'll pretend the kids are in boxcars. these idea of pedagogical approaches, and there's an interest of simulations. And in your notebook there's an article from the Anti-Defamation League talking about the problems of using simulation. I don't know if, I'm going to go out on a limb here a little bit, I don't know of a responsible Holocaust expert who agrees with the use of simulations. It's just, it's a bogus approach. Now that's not to say some simulations are okay. I mean, the simulation where you do the stock market simulation is fine. You know, lawyers do simulations when they have mock courts and so forth and so on. But for this particular subject, it just doesn't work. I know a few years ago at Conner Prairie, there was a simulation where some of the kids were slave owners and some of the kids were slave masters. And I just, when I heard about that for the first time, I thought, gee, you know, what are they thinking about here? Failure to provide adequate contextualization. That's what we just mentioned a minute ago. That you have to constantly put events within larger and larger events. For example, one of the topics you look at in Holocaust, and it's a topic that I think sometimes is, or not sometimes, is often overdone, is the topic of rescue. Rescue is an important topic. It's also just one topic that, again, is sometimes overemphasized. But it's simply not enough to say this is what rescue was, because rescue, or the possibility of rescue in Poland in '41, was a very different circumstance from the possibility of rescue at the time of the Danish rescue in September, October of '43. And therefore to simply say rescue is a faulty approach. Resistance the same way. Resistance in France in '44, which was quite extensive, was a very different circumstance than the possibility of resistance, say, in some of the killing centers in '42 or '43. So you always have to contextualize within larger and larger events. And again, I think of the study of any history. Again, Gettysburg doesn't make sense unless you're studying World War II, the Civil War, and so forth and so on. Failure to address the issue of age appropriateness. The Holocaust Museum has to be very careful not to say, don't do this, because as a federal institution, it can't prescribe curriculum. However, one of the things that the museum does say is that the teaching of this subject below the middle school level is very problematic. They used to say 7th grade, and now they simply say middle school because they're all different kinds of age levels, you know that. Probably the worst example of this that I've ever heard of, there's a lady by the name of Karen Shawn, who used to be the director of a Jewish day school in New Jersey, and she's now in the faculty of Yeshiva University in New York City. And she writes about doing a workshop one time, and asking the teachers at the beginning of the workshop, introduce yourself, where do you teach, what grade do you teach, give us a 2-minute overview of your Holocaust unit. And she's going around the room and people are saying, you know, I teach U.S. history, I teach world history. Finally came to a teacher who said, well, I teach kindergarten, and therefore I don't want to scare the kids, so the only words I use with my kindergartners are skeletons and burning. Now, we have a 5th grade, we have a 5-year-old who's in kindergarten. There is no way I'm going to talk to her about this subject. In fact, we have an 11-year-old grandson who is in 6th grade, and he and I are just now, this fall, beginning to talk about this subject. It's a very, very problematic issue here. Matters of historical inaccuracy. There are a lot of misconceptions about this subject. When we get to the definition here in a few minutes, we'll probably see some of those. You have to be very careful with regard to questions of historical inaccuracy. There are a lot of misconceptions out there about the Holocaust. For example, some people have the assumption that Hitler came to power in January of '33, and I'll get back to the idea of talking about Hitler in a few minutes. Came to power in '33, and immediately there were death camps. The first mass murder did not occur until June of '41. That's 8.5 years after the Nazi regime was established. And so there are these matters of historical inaccuracy you have to really be careful about. Failure to use precise terminology. One of the things you'll hear is people will say, well, in the concentration camps. The problem there is there are 4 different categories of concentration camps. There are political camps, there were transit camps, there were forced labor camps, there were killing centers. And therefore, if you simply say the concentration camps, bing, 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 that's a matter of historical, of imprecise terminology. Imprecise terminology because the circumstance in, let's say, a political camp like Sachsenhausen or Dachau in 1935 is very different from the circumstance in a killing center in, let's say, Auschwitz-Birkenau in, let's say, 1943. So the idea of precise terminology is very, very important to think about. And also the idea of avoiding inappropriate terminology. For many years, the term you always heard to describe places like Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau was an extermination camp. In fact, the Holocaust Museum still has the term on the websites in a few places. What's wrong with calling it an extermination camp?
It denotes that what you're getting rid of is something bad.
Exactly, exactly. You're almost playing into the terminology that the Nazis used, because what do we exterminate? We exterminate lice, we exterminate vermin. So what happened was, over the course of time, historians got away from the use of the term extermination camp and went to the term death camp. The preferred term today is killing center. So again, this idea of precise terminology is very, very important. Another example of imprecise terminology is to equate Nazis with Germans. That is an inappropriate equation to make. In the same way it's inappropriate to equate communists with Russians back in the Soviet era. So you have to be very, very careful. Another example of imprecise terminology is to consistently say Hitler did this. Several years ago I did a study of textbooks for the museum on Holocaust sections of Pearson, McDougall, and what's the third company? McGraw-Hill. And there was one section in there in this textbook on the Holocaust. There were, I think it was 11 pictures of Hitler in a couple of different sections. Well, if all you see is pictures of Hitler, what do kids assume? It was just Hitler. Now, is Hitler the linchpin? Sure. But it took tens of thousands of people for the whole process to take place. So if you say Hitler did this, Hitler did that. For example, in this textbook, Hitler invaded Poland. Hitler didn't invade Poland. Who invaded Poland? The Wehrmacht, the German army. That was under Hitler's orders. But you have to be very careful in that kind of stuff. And I remember talking about this one time when I was teaching at Snyder. And said, you know, don't overdo Hitler. And about 5 minutes later, some kid says, hey, Lindquist, you just use the word Hitler 6 times. I mean, we kind of fall into the pattern here. So you have to be very precise and talk about the Nazi party or the Nazi regime or the German army. You have to be very precise in your terminology. Overgeneralizations. Again, to say, the Germans did this or the Jews did that. You have to be very, very careful about that kind of overgeneralization. I was working at the museum one of the times a few years ago, and we were dealing with something. There was a group that I was with called the Regional Museum Educators at the museum, and we worked for the museum part-time. And somebody finally said, you know what, one of our overgeneralizations? He said, the Jews. Just like there's just one blanket group out here. So you have to be careful of that. Use of historically and viable resources. There is a huge amount of material available. The question is, what do you use, what don't you use? And I'm going to, maybe step on some people's toes here, but probably the worst example of that is Boy in Striped Pajamas. How many are familiar with it? Boy in the Striped Pajamas. It's this little novel. It was written 2004, 2005. Turned into a movie a couple, 3 years later. The book is very interesting. The movie is pretty well done. The problem is, it not only didn't happen, it couldn't happen. And so the question becomes, why use something that is historically not only inaccurate, but implausible, when there's so much good that could be used? So I think you really have to really consider those kinds of sources. Another example would be, some of you may remember this, in the late 1990s, I think it was 1998, there was an Academy Award-winning film, Life is Beautiful. Any of you remember that one? I mean, it was a very well-done film. I think, Lee helped me, got an Academy Award for something. Cinematography or something like that?
I think it was Picture of the Year.
Yeah, whatever. It's about this concentration camp situation where the boy and the father are in the camp, and the father's trying to keep the boy from realizing what's going on, so he turns the whole camp experience into a farce. Beautifully done movie, absolutely historically invaluable, or impossible. The question becomes then, why use something of questionable historical value when you have so much that's good? Now, this is not to say you don't use historical fiction. Historical fiction can be used if used properly and if it's possible, if it's plausible. Are any of you familiar with a little children's book called Friedrich? Have you ever heard of that? Friedrich is a little children's book. It's actually one of 3 by the same author, an author who grew up in Germany. And it's sort of autobiographical about his friendship with a little Jewish boy. The little Jewish boy's name is Friedrich. It didn't happen, but it could have happened. And it is very well contextualized within the events that happened at the time. So if you're teaching middle school or whatever it happens to be, or if you want to do a nice lit thing, it's a very, very useful source because it is contextualized accurately. Again, it's fiction, but it could have happened. And it is well contextualized. Another example, not from the Holocaust, but if you're familiar, I'm sure many of you are, with All Quiet on the Western Front. That's fiction. Is it accurate given the things that happened on the Western Front in 1918? Exactly. So I think you have to choose sources that are viable. And I think it's a very important thing to use. Another example of this, and a very, very different example of this, is how you use something like Anne Frank. Anne Frank is wonderful. I mean, Anne Frank is, for years and years and years, has been the entry level into the Holocaust for a lot of kids, mainly at the middle school level. The problem with Anne Frank is that it's not really about the Holocaust. Because what don't you see in Anne Frank? You don't see the ghettos, you don't see deportation, you don't see the camps. Now that's not to say it's inaccurate, I mean it's true from her perspective, but remember the last entry is occurs a couple of days before they're arrested. So to say that Anne Frank teaches the Holocaust is incorrect. It's a good entry. Similarly, if any of you are familiar with Elie Wiesel's classic Night. Night is one of the classics. Some say it is the classic piece of Holocaust literature. The problem is, and I'm not sure the word problem is the word to use, but I'll use it. The problem is that Wiesel is never affected by the Holocaust until 1944 because he's from Romania. And Romania was an ally, sort of an ally, of Germany until 44. So he is not affected until 44. So if you say to students, here's the definitive story of the Holocaust, you're missing all the things that happened before 44. Because again, he's not affected until that particular period of time. So what you have to do is get a variety of sources that show the whole picture. And again, Night can be useful in that regard, but it's certainly not the only thing in that regard. So that's not an unviable source, it's a source that has to be used with caution. And finally, the last one, and this is maybe the trickiest one, focusing on the what instead of the why. The Holocaust is like any other historical event in terms of what happened, when did it happen, where did it happen, so forth and so on. The critical question, and the answer I don't think has ever been answered, and I'm guessing it never will be answered, but that you have to try to answer, think about dealing with that one with your students, because students want to know, this, is why it occurred. How was it able to occur, given where it occurred, how it occurred, and so forth. How do you explain the behavior of the SS? How do you explain the behavior of typical Germans? How do you explain the behavior of people in occupied countries? How do you explain the behavior of the rescuers of La Chambeau in southern France, French Huguenots who rescued probably 5,000 or more Jews, mainly children? How do you explain the rescue in Denmark? How do you explain people like Schindler? This question of how do you explain the why of the event is very critical to achieve. Okay, a couple more things and then we'll get to the first activity. Rationale for the seminar. If you read this quotation by the late Henry Friedlander, I think it's a very important quotation. He was a survivor, became a very well-known historian, passed away just a few years ago. And I think what's important to note here, folks, is the date we wrote this, 1979. In 1979, Holocaust history was still sort of on the periphery. There was some Holocaust education going on. The movie, the TV movie, Holocaust had been on. There was a lot of interest in the Holocaust. Some teachers were beginning to do it in bits and pieces, usually, by the way, with Anne Frank. And Friedlander says too much is being taught by too many without focus. Now, he said that in 1979. I can't imagine what he's going to say 38 years later. And I think that's the reason for a program like this today, to give you some things to think about. I'm not going to sit here and say, do this, and this. What we are going to suggest is think about this, and this as you teach the subject. And we congratulate you for being here and wanting to take that. It's a challenge to do this. And finally, in 1993, the museum statement, which was released with the opening of the museum in 1993, these questions of rationale, why do this? Whenever you teach this subject, and obviously whenever you teach any subject, but I think particularly very, very critical subjects, apartheid, slavery, genocide, Holocaust, some of these subjects like that, you really have to ask these questions even more intensively than you would ask them if you're teaching quadratic equations or something like that. Okay? Now, we'll look at this for just a minute here. We'll go ahead. Jackie, can we dim the lights very quickly for just a minute? And we'll get you started in just a minute here. I always like to just run this while people are having breakfast and so forth, just to acquaint them. And again, those of you who've been to the museum,
David?
that's fine. Do that, and we'll get back to the starting one here in just a minute. How many of you remember that one? The tower faces? Actually, I'll go through. These are prisoner uniforms. Each category of prisoner, there was a different badge. There were 24, 25 different badges for different categories of prisoners and different locations of prisoners by country and so forth and so on. This is from the T4 exhibit, the murder of people with disabilities. The building in the background was one of the T4 centers. This is from Daniel's story. This is the one for younger kids. Story about this little boy. Again, it's fictional, but contextualized. A Danish rescue boat, 1943, the rescue of the Jews in Denmark in October of 1943. That's one of the boats that was used. When the museum was open, kids from all over the country sent in tiles. Hard to imagine. These kids are now probably in their, late 30s, I guess it would be. And there are several hundred of these on the bottom floor, the basement floor of the museum. These are posters showing the decitizenization of German Jews in the 1930s, citizens to outcast over in the corner, all the laws that were brought into place. The entrance to the museum at night, the 14th Street entrance to the museum. Washington Monument. They always have that so people can orient into the Washington Monument. This is the other side, the Eisenhower Plaza, the west side of the museum entrance. Again, orientation with the Washington Monument. Main hallway, the main atrium of the museum, obviously. I'll come back and talk about that in a minute when we're done here. The Auschwitz barracks, which have now been returned. The Polish government asked for them back. A very controversial process that went place then. Boxcars. It's not known, by the way, if this boxcar was actually used. If you ever look at the logo, it says of the type that was used. It's not known if that particular one was used. And again, the tower faces. These are all photographs from one town in what is today Belarus. One town is represented here. couple things about that. If you notice, I said boxcar, not cattle car. Why? So again, it's a matter of precise terminology. If you say it's a cattle car, and a lot of sources will use the term cattle car, what's the problem with using that term?
We liken them to animals.
Exactly, exactly. And so, again, a matter of precise terminology. A way to teach that maybe be to talk about this process, and some student will probably say, well, I've seen pictures of the cattle cars, and that gives you your entry to this discussion of precise terminology. Box cars rather than that. Now, you even hear a lot of survivors use the term cattle car, but it's an idea of moving into a more precise, a more correct terminology. And I think that one of the things that can come out of teaching this also is that students begin to understand that kind of thing. They begin to understand the power of language. They begin to understand how implications drawn or suggested or deflected from language comes into play. And I think it's a very, very valuable skill for kids to learn. Okay, so you ready to go to work, everybody? You ready to go to work, everybody? Good. Okay. Let me go over here and switch around here. Okay. There's a bit of a delay till this comes up, so just get me in here. Come up here. There's a delay on this machine. There we go. What we're going to ask you to do here is develop your own definition of the Holocaust. And the reason I like to start with this, and whether or not it's a program like this, a program for pre-service teachers, Carol and Josh have taken the evening course that I sometimes teach for adults. We started with this one. I think this is a very good entry into the subject for several reasons. First, a lot of times kids will come into the Holocaust and they will say, well, gee, I've already studied it. I read something when I was in middle school or elementary school, or I saw a movie, or I saw a website, and we'll talk about websites later on. Adults will bring a lot of what they assume to be background knowledge to the study of the subject. And this is not unusual. I mean, kids have seen World War II movies or whatever it happens to be. The problem here is that in many cases, the knowledge, the information is probably a better word to use actually. The information that students bring, or people bring in general, adults too, is not necessarily accurate information. And it's not necessarily accurate either factually or perceptually. And I'll try to explain that term. A factual inaccuracy is pretty obvious. If, for example, you say, the first mass murder occurred in 1934, that's wrong. It's factually incorrect. It was 1941. If, for example, you say, the war ended in 1949, well, we know the war ended in 45. So the factual inaccuracies are somewhat easy to pick out, although people bring them. What's more important to consider, I think, are what we call perceptual inaccuracies. And a perceptual inaccuracy is an inaccuracy where the fact is correct, but it is stated in a way that leads to an incorrect assumption. Let me give you an example, and this actually comes from one of these textbooks that I talked about a few minutes ago. One of the textbooks says the following. Again, this is a world history textbook that was on the India adoption list. I think it was the 2009 adoption. The book says this: Anne Frank and her family moved from Germany to the Netherlands in 1934. Now, actually, Mr. Frank moved the end of 33. The family moved in 34. So that is correct. The second part of the statement says, and went into hiding. So here's the whole statement. Anne Frank and her family moved from Germany to the Netherlands in 1934 and went into hiding. Now, did they move in 34? Yes. Did they move from Germany to the Netherlands? Yes. Did they go into hiding? Yes. But when did they go into hiding? The way the sentence is written, it sounds what?
Right away.
They went right away. When did they actually go into hiding?
Not right away.
Not right now. Very good. That's a good answer. When did they go into hiding? 42. So the statement is correct. I mean, there are three parts there. They moved in 34, Mr. Frank a few weeks ago. They moved Germany to Holland. They went into hiding. The three parts of the statement are correct, but the way the statement is written leads you to what? An incorrect assumption. So again, that's one of the things we have here. Again, if you ask a lot of people, you know, when did the first mass killings occur? A lot of people would say, well, right after Hitler came to power. Where did they? Well, Germany. How many mass murder actions, actionem, occurred in Germany? How many mass murder actions occurred in Germany?
None.
0. They all occurred in the East, Poland and the East. So again, this is a very important thing to do. And one of the things I think this exercise does is it gives you an idea to kind of see what's going on with students' thinking. What we must do then is make sure that we identify these misconceptions and correct them. And again, this is something that I think is unique to the study of history. If you're teaching quadratic equations, most kids who've never heard of a quadratic equation have no perception about it. But when you start studying historical topics for whatever reason, kids have misconceptions, and sometimes we need to undo before we can do, I guess is the way to do it. I used to coach golf at Snyder. One of the things we always had to do is undo the bad grip. If you play golf, you know, grip is correct, right? Is important, right? Well, before you can start teaching the correct grip, you have to make sure people understand what? There's an incorrect grip. Same thing here. You have to undo the correct misconceptions. And you have to be able to identify them. So here's our response. An opening exercise that allows us to know what students already know, and again, what information they have. Find out what the inaccurate information is. As a part of this process, we'll look at a considerable amount of Holocaust history through the example of anecdotal examples and so forth and so on. It introduces the complexity of the Holocaust. And I think this word complexity is a very, very important word to understand. Some historical events can be pretty well understood at a somewhat surface level. But most historical events, and particularly I think this historical event, you really have to look at the complexities of it. You really have to look at the underlying notions and so forth and so on. And, as we're going to have you folks do in just a minute, it gets people started, engaged from the start. So, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Build your own definition of the Holocaust. And you can do this in one of two ways. You can now don't start yet. It's a little bit more complicated. You can either write a paragraph, or you can do a bulleted list. And I think the bulleted list is the easier way to go. It's simply a bit easier to organize. A bulleted list that considers these 7 key questions. What was it? And I'll leave this up here for you. And we've also got a handout that has it. When did it occur? I will tell you that of the 7 questions, this is the only one where there's a more or less definitive answer, or at least obvious answer. By whom? Who did it? Perpetrators, that's a word we're going to use. How did they do it? Process, that's a word we're going to use. Against whom? In other words, who are the intended victims? Victim groups, plural. With what intended result? When the perpetrators decided to do something to a group of victims, what did they have as the end result? What was the goal of what they were doing? And why was that the goal? So in other words, when the perpetrators picked this group to be victims, what did they intend to have happen, and why did they make that choice? Now right away, there's a 4-part kind of scenario there that gets to be rather complicated. Okay, everybody understand the assignment? Okay, we'll take about 10 minutes. No, individual. I'm sorry, individuals. Thank you. Yeah, I did this right here. Jackie and Bonnie are going to give you the questions. too, so. And then you can put that in your notebook. Now, Professor Roberts, Professor Roden, no for cheating over here.
The books,
Oh,
the other. You want? Oh, yeah. You want to make kids nervous when you do this, do exactly what I'm doing, that's kind of walk around. I used to, when I was teaching, I'd give a test and then I'd let them get started. After about 5 minutes, I'd walk around and start doing the Jeopardy, that. It drove them crazy. Excuse me. You got one of the key words in it already. You're fine.
thinking, I'm still thinking.
Some of you are starting to get some of the key words in there, and we'll look at some very key words as we go through this.
Yeah, I mean, I would pair myself. This one.
There's some different terminologies there. That's a training to do. Some call them bystanders, some call them participants by inaction, some call them enactors. That's one of the complexities. How far, and that's the important question. For example, is the clerk who sits there and figures out the train schedule responsible? And one of the things you have to do when you kind of disarms kids is you say that quite municipality because it can't be determined. It's one of the complexities.
How many did it to say no?
How many did it?
One of the, my kids have this. They have somebody back on the phone during, but they wouldn't know what happened.
Okay. We had on the museum website asked me because there's a section on there was a major exhibition called Life. I think it's still on. So ask me about it. And you teach where? David? How's Dave?
He's great.
Like Dave's parents. Dave's dad. And that's where I stick with it. His dad used to come to our house for Thanksgiving. He was waiting for us. Dave's mom. About another minute or two here, please. So there's no such thing as perfection.
teaching biology. I do both mix it.
Not as much stress on biology as English and math. I need to find it. I need to find it.
Same things. I taught freshmen. So I taught the night. Yeah, that was a little bit. But then Brad came with all the bundle things, and then they were making a big deal about the bundle tasks, and they were scoring them against other schools, and I'm going, these are supposed to tell us what we need to look at, not compare them with everyone else.
Why do I care about the others? Why do I care?
But they cared a lot about it.
And I said, all that does is just keep watching the ones that we love, and you can't help it. You can't compare any other schools because they all have different.
They all have different clientele.
These arguments don't sound good. You know, both my in-laws taught in East Allen, and you're voicing the same concerns they voiced like 20 years ago. Nothing changes.
Nope. But yeah, no, I know what the stress is for English. That's why I don't teach it unless I have to.
What level do you teach?
And then I was amazed at,
Yeah, I stopped for teaching.
I was amazed at ninth grade how little I knew about basic English.
She's amazing. Really amazing.
Like starting with a blank slate, you gotta teach English language and at least semi-able to write something.
Well, that's like, I'm sure you guys have a large Spanish population.
Okay, folks,
In the special ed program, that's like,
what we're gonna do is go through and have you make some suggestions here. And I wanna just set some, not a ground rule, but one of the things with using this with students is encourage them to not be afraid of saying something that's incorrect. And I'm guessing that as we get here, some of you may say something that's not exactly correct. Don't be concerned about that. I think that's part of the process. I think sometimes with kids, we get them so focused on the right answer that they're afraid to take a risk, an educational risk. So please, you know, if you say something, then we have to say, no, that's not quite right. Don't be offended. That's part of the process here that I think comes into play. Josh, do you want to do some writing on the flip chart for us here? Get you to work here. So what we're going to do is just go through on the flip chart. There's one marker right over there. And just kind of answer some of these, and then we'll go back and do it formally. We actually have a handout we'll give you here in a few minutes. Actually has 4 different formal definitions of the Holocaust on it. So don't try to copy a lot of things down here of the formal one, because we'll give it to you in a nice handout. So first of all, let's just begin. Somebody want to give us just and don't try to go through the whole definition, just something that answers that first question very specific. I saw several of you had some key terms on your definition. So who wants to be brave off the top here? Yeah.
I'll do it.
Good.
All right. I have for that first one, essentially, the Holocaust was a concerted effort by the Nazi government to eradicate European Jewry occurring between 1941 and 1945.
Okay, good. Concerted effort. What I'm going to do here, folks, and again, I would suggest you is kind of edit for keywords. Fair enough? So concerted effort. Good. That's true. That's very well. It was very deliberate. It's a key word, deliberate. Somebody else want to volunteer something for that same one? By the way, if you would just, first time you do it, give your name and where you're from also, if you would do that, please. So,
My name is Carter Ringel, Carroll High School.
I won't say anything about football. Snyder. Or I caught it Snyder, so. Although Doug Dinan used to be at Snyder.
Talk to him about
Yeah.
that.
You want to coach it? Yeah.
Sarah Wilson, West Noble High School. I have the systematic and planned annihilation of Jews by the Nazis.
Okay, systematic. That, by the way, is one of the really key words. How many of you had systematic? And I know several of you. Good. That is one of the really critical words. Systematic. Annihilation is also one of the key words. Somebody else. It's the problem, you gotta get somebody to get it.
One thing that we're not hitting on is it wasn't just the Jewish people, it was anybody that didn't fit into the Nazi ideology, or, I mean, it was a theological and, what's the word, is it genealogical,
Racial's the word we get.
racial?
And actually, let's
profile.
hold off on that, because that will come in right down here.
Okay.
That's against him, yeah, that's good, you're a step ahead, but you're fine, yeah. And introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, I'm Patrick from Bishop Dwenger. I put the Holocaust was a premeditated and systematic mass imprisonment and genocide of those considered to be undesirable by the Nazi Germany regime under the leadership of Hitler
Okay,
during
good.
World War II.
Key word there is that word genocide. The word genocide was not known at the time. The word genocide was coined in 1944 by a Polish-Jewish immigrant to the United States, a man by the name of Raphael Lemkin. He was a lawyer, very skilled in languages. He went to work for the State Department. He started reading documents coming out of the intelligence agencies about this thing going on in Poland, mass murder. He said, we need a name for it. He knew Greek and Latin, so he put together the word genocide. So genocide is a key word there. One more. Yes.
I said classified.
Introduce yourself.
Oh yeah, I'm Andrea Galanis. Right now I'm just subbing, so if you need a sub, let me know, please.
Don't say just subbing, you are subbing. The word just says it's not, I used to tell elementary people, don't ever say I'm just a third grade teacher. No, you're a third grade teacher and it's important, so
All
go
right,
ahead.
well,
And I subbed, I know.
Okay, I am the sub then.
Okay.
I am the
Even
sub.
better.
You know, you gotta have that confidence.
You got it, you got it.
I said classifies Nazi Germany's attempt at restoring Germany to its former glory and instilling the perfect Aryan race.
Ooh, good. Let's just say German, what do we say, Josh? That German glory thing. Josh, give me a term for it. I'm drawing a blank here. German status. That just says German status for lack of a better term for it. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. When? This, by the way, is the only one that's really definitive. When? And Lee and I were just talking about it a minute ago, Dr. Robin. When did it occur?
38 to 45.
38 to 45. Why 38, Carol?
That's really when the German people began, the German leaders began ostracizing the Jews and taking away their employment and their residences and forcing them into subjugation, basically.
Yeah, one definition is 38-45 because of Kristallnacht in 45.
Yeah, November.
Couldn't it be theoretically argued, though, with the publication of Mein Kampf, where Hitler originally sets out the groundwork for what he's going to do to the Jewish people?
It's certainly, do you know when Mein Kampf was published? Do you know when it was published?
In 1925.
Yeah, 24 or 25. It's just actually been republished for the first time in Germany this year. It's always been illegal in Germany up until this year. That's a theory.
1935 Nuremberg laws.
35. That's one of the days that people pick as Nuremberg laws. The definition the museum uses is 33 to 45. Why?
Creation of Dachau.
Yes, it's the Hitler era. And Lee and I were talking about this a minute ago. He had to go back to class. But he said, what does the museum say? And when the definition was being developed by the museum historians, it's the exact same thing. 38 because of Nuremberg, because of Kristallnacht. 35, the Nuremberg laws. 39, the invasion of Poland. 41, mass murder. And one of the historians finally said, look, it's the Nazi era. So 33 to 45. Now, the thing about Mein Kampf being published is an interesting theory. I've never heard that one before. And I think you could almost argue that. At least that's preliminary to it. But for our purposes, 33 to 45. The Nazi regime begins in 33. Why 45? End of the war. Okay. All right. By whom?
Robbie McCurr, Carroll High School. I said the Nazi regime led by Adolf Hitler, and I said that there are also millions of Nazis that were complicit in the rounding up and deportation and forced labor and killing.
Let's just say Nazi plus, for lack of a better term, okay? And this is one of the ones that gets very complex when we get to it. Nazi plus. How? Actually, we've already answered that word systematic. That's one of the words we use. Against whom?
Drew Heiniger from Bishop Luers.
Okay, welcome.
People of Jewish and Roma ancestry, political dissidents, or words.
Distance, yeah.
Thanks. Homosexuals, and the mentally and physically handicapped.
Okay, good. So just various groups for now. We'll just say various victim groups, each victim group chosen for a particular reason and with a particular intended result. Okay, what intended results? Again, we'll come back to this one. Why? That word that sometimes bothers people on here is the word ideology. Ideology is a nice, fancy academic word. It denotes what? You have an ideology. What does that denote?
Formal system of belief.
Exactly. Very good. A formal system of belief. And that's a very good way to put it. Okay. So let's now go through. Thanks, Josh. So now let's actually go through the definition. Or the various parts. Okay. And there's a time delay here for whatever reason. I'm not sure why that happens. There's a time delay. I'm not sure why that happens. There we go. Okay. Okay. First, a specific genocide. Don't try to get this down again. This is going to be in the definition in here. A specific genocidal event. We just defined the word genocide. Now we say specific because there are other genocides, and they're still going on. The situation in Myanmar right now being an example. Persecution. This is a picture probably taken in Poland, probably 1939, 1940, showing persecution. The persecution is you have two people on the street. They're wearing the Star of David. Persecution. Persecution in terms of taking away citizenship rights, all those different kinds of things. Following persecution, what happens? Beyond persecution, you have, somebody used the word before, it begins with an A.
Annihilation.
Annihilation. Persecution leading eventually to annihilation. This is a picture, well, anybody want to guess what this picture shows?
It's one of the gas chamber and
Yeah, it's actually one of the crematoria. It's a crematoria at one of the killing centers called Majdanek. Majdanek was one of the 6 killing centers. All 6 killing centers were in Poland, in central and eastern Poland. Majdanek is one that's not very well known in the West. It was liberated by the Soviet Red Army in late 1944. It's near the city of Lublin in southeastern Poland. So persecution leading to annihilation. Again, it's important to note that no mass murders occur for the first 8.5. The Nazi era is 2/3 over before there's any mass murder. It's a very important concept to note here. It's an important concept to note because things have to build up and so forth. Persecution of various types in various places. And again, that's an important point to note here, folks. Various types in various places. What happens in Germany in, say, 35 is very different than what happens in Poland in, say, 41. Again, you always have to make sure that students understand there is no one singular thing going on here. 33 to 45 we just talked about. Nazi Germany and its collaborators. Now, here we have to define a word for students. What is a collaborator? How might we define the word collaborator, or the verb to collaborate?
Should we work together on this?
That's exactly what it is. That's collaboration. Very good. That's a great way to answer it. Collaboration implies that you're doing it, but you're almost not the main focus. Okay? So Nazi Germany and its collaborators. And here's the first example, I think, of a really complex answer to this. This is a map. Hope you can see it okay. This is a map from the Holocaust Museum website. And it's a map of the Axis Alliance in 1939-1941. Now, an alliance is military, right? So this is Nazi Germany, Italy, and their allies. And if you look at the map, and again, it's a little bit small, you have Germany. Let me get this out here real quick. Let me get this out very quick. You have Germany. Notice there's that little area of East Poland that's distended there. And then you have Italy. How many of you knew that Italy was an ally of Germany? Sure, Mussolini, right? How many of you knew that Hungary was an ally of Germany? Okay, a few people. How many of you knew that Bulgaria and Romania were allies of Germany? Okay. How many of you knew that Finland was an ally of Germany? Okay. Why was Finland an ally of Germany?
United hatred against the Russians.
Yeah, exactly. Because what happens is when Germany invades Poland in 39, the Soviets also invade Poland in 39. And that allows the Soviets to take over the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, incorporate them into the Soviet Union. They're not freed until, they don't become independent until when? 92, full of communism. And then the Soviet Union invades Finland. Finland had been part of the Russian Empire for a long, long time. And the Finns fight very valiantly and really beat back the Soviets in what's called the Winter War or the White War. The Finns needed military supplies. Where did they get those military supplies? From Germany. So Finland is an ally of Germany. Is Finland a collaborator in the Holocaust? The answer is no. No Jew was ever deported from Finland. The Finns simply wouldn't have anything to do with it. So here's one of these complex issues, folks. You can be an ally of Nazi Germany without being a collaborator in the Holocaust. What about Hungary and Romania? Are they collaborators? No. Because as long as Hungary and Romania were independent on the side of the Axis, on the side of the German side, there are no deportations. The last great deportation to Auschwitz occurs in the spring of '44 from Hungary and also from Western Romania. And it occurs because Hungary and Romania had pulled out of the alliance and Germany then invades its former allies. So you have to be careful here. Alliance does not equal collaboration. So who were collaborators? Well, you had individuals in all these places. You had the Vichy French government. All of you know about the Vichy French government, whether or not you realize it, because of a very famous movie. Casablanca. Because Claude Rains, playing Inspector Renault, is an official of the Vichy French government that controls Casablanca. The Vichy French government was a very collaborationist government. So collaborationist, in fact, that Marshal Pétain, the great World War I hero who led Vichy, is tried for treason after the war. And what does Claude Rains do at the end of Casablanca? To symbolize his break with Vichy France, Bergman and what's his name have just taken off. They just shot Major Strasser. What does Claude Rains do? He picks up a bottle of Vichy water, and what does he do with it? That end scene in the movie. He doesn't pour it out. He slams it in the wastebasket, right? So Vichy France is a collaborationist government. In Denmark, you have collaborators. You have members of the SS. So collaboration is not necessarily alliance. Important point to note. Okay. Let's continue. How? State-sponsored. What does it mean if something is state-sponsored?
Directed by the government.
Not only directed by it, but what even beyond that? Even beyond that. Even beyond that.
Legislation.
A word that begins with I.
Implemented.
Implemented by the government. The government did it. This is persecution not allowed by the government. This is persecution staged by the government. Now, this picture here. The man on the left is an SS officer. It's a German courtroom. And then you see two judges dressed in the standard judicial robes. But there's two things about what they're doing that indicates the state-sponsored nature of everything. What two things indicate the state-sponsored nature of this? These are judges.
The Heil Hitler.
They're doing the Heil Hitler. The other thing is, you can't really see it from a distance, but there's something right here on his robe. Anybody who's up close can figure out what that is?
It's the Nazi eagle.
It's a Nazi pin, a Nazi party membership pin. Why do judges wear black robes?
Because originally they were from the clergy, weren't they, sir?
Well, something, but beyond that, that's part of it, but beyond that. Again, word begins with I. Impartiality. The judge is to be impartial. By wearing black robes, the judge is supposed to be taking his or her personality out and judging things only on what? The law. What would happen to any American juror who had a political party pin, sitting up there in front of the vote for Smith or vote for Jones? I mean, we laugh at it because why? It just wouldn't happen in our system of law. But here you have a judge giving the Heil Hitler and wearing a party pin. State-sponsored. Systematic. What does it mean to be, and this is a word several of you had, what does it mean to be systematic?
It's an evolving process.
It's an evolving process. First of all, it's a process. It's organized. It has processes. It has rules. It has regulations. It has systems and so forth. It has processes. The key down here of the map says Greater Germany, Nazi camps, major Nazi camps, I wish it would say major German camps, 1944. What's the key word in that key?
Major.
Why major?
So that implies that there's others.
It implies that there are others. If indeed every camp, concentration camp, were on this map, the map would be absolutely useless. Anybody know why?
Yes, it'd be all black.
It'd be all black. Several years ago, Holocaust Museum historians started figuring, say, how many camps were there? And they did the research. Anybody know what number they came up with?
4,000.
4,000? They thought they were going to come up with about 5,000. They actually came up with about 40,000. And the reason they had that, there are so many of these small camps that were only in existence for a short period of time. So if you look at here, if these are the major camps, just forget about all the dozens of camps that were operated short-term transit camps. Why would the word systematic apply to this camp structure?
Every camp had to have leadership, places to live.
Keep going, keep going.
Structure,
Keep
bureaucracy,
going.
I mean,
Keep going.
every single one.
Yeah, think about what it would take to operate this system. Somebody had to schedule all the guards. Somebody had to lay the piping and the electrical wires. Somebody had to make sure that the guards were fed. Somebody had to prepare the train schedule. Let me give you a story. Several years ago, the Holocaust Museum in Detroit did a week-long seminar for Michigan teachers, and I was invited to come up and do some things. And one of the other presenters was a professor from University of Michigan Dearborn. And I was looking at the schedule, and he was going to talk about the German railroad system. And I thought, boy, this is going to be a dull hour and a half. It's one of the most fascinating lectures I've ever heard on the Holocaust, because he went into detail the German railroad system. Now, those of you who've been to Europe, particularly Germany, know the railroad system. You go every place on train, right? He went through the details of this, the scheduling process. The fact that somebody had to schedule that these guards got off and these guards got on someplace. All that kind of thing. So think about the systematic nature of all this. Think about the process of compiling the lists. In 1935, the regime did a census in Germany. And it did the census to determine who the Jews were. Somebody had to take those census lists, those census forms, and compile them. One of the earliest computers, called the Hollerin, was actually used to do this. It was a punch card kind of thing. But think about how many people had to be involved to make that system work. So it's systematic, and it's bureaucratic. what does the idea of bureaucracy mean?
You have different departments within the government that do different things.
And that are responsible in different ways. Now, you're all in school systems, most of you are in school systems, as in both school and university. Think about the idea of bureaucracy. In a bureaucracy, to whom are you responsible?
Your direct supervisor.
The person directly above you. And who is responsible to you?
Person directly under
The person directly below you, right? So think about how bureaucracy works. Do you use it, if you are, let's see, Jeff, you're in Fort Wayne. In Fort Wayne, I can say this because my wife used to be deputy superintendent in Fort Wayne. In Fort Wayne, there's this ubiquitous term, Grile did it. Those of you who are in Fort Wayne know what I'm talking about. Roberts, don't deny it because you've said it to me. Now, what is it? The term Grile is the administrative building. So anything that happens bad in Fort Wayne, at Wayne or Snyder or wherever it happens to be, somebody says Grile did it. And if they really want to do it, they say the 4th floor at Grile did it, because that's where the superintendent's office is. How many times do you suppose that Dr. Robinson visits every school in Fort Wayne? Not very often. There's a level of command. And it's very easy in a bureaucracy to forget 2, 3 levels up, 2, 3 levels down. The chart we have over here is a chart prepared by American jurists for the doctors' trials after the war. It's a chart showing the bureaucracy of the German medical system. Hitler's at the top. The key doctor, Dr. Karl Brandt, is in the middle, and then all these different things. What's the nature of the functioning of a bureaucracy? A long word begins with A. Ends with Y. Ever do that with your kids? That's a great way to get them guessing words. It's a great way to get kids involved. Begins with A, ends with Y.
Authority?
Not well, authority is part of it, but there's another word.
Accountability.
I'm sorry?
Accountability.
I'm sorry?
Accountability.
Actually, non-accountability, Patty. Why?
What you use. Sorry. What was decided?
Anonymity. Think about that. Anonymity. Why anonymity? What can you do in a bureaucracy? You can blame, exactly, you can hide, you can blame it on somebody else. This brings up one of the real issues that's difficult in dealing with the Holocaust. Who's responsible? Some would say, who's responsible? Hitler. If you say Hitler's responsible, what are you ignoring? Everybody below him. The question then becomes, how far down the bureaucracy is responsible? Is Himmler responsible? Yeah. Is Eichmann responsible? Yeah. How about the janitor in the Reich Office for Citizenship? Is the janitor in the Reich Office for Citizenship in Berlin, is that janitor responsible? Got very quiet in here. Why? Besides the kids. Why doesn't anybody have an answer to that?
Depends if he knew.
Did he have any actual control over
Yeah,
what was going on?
exactly. We can't answer the question. Is
The students ask this question and go back,
Sure.
you can go all the way back to the collaborative part, because you talk about the 4 group perpetrators,
Exactly.
victims,
Yeah.
bystanders and rescuers, and they're always like, what about that group in between
Yep.
bystanders and perpetrators? Like, what are they called?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, what Jeff just said, if you heard what he said at the beginning, that's the question students ask. Because students want to know that. And the answer to that question is, I don't know. And by the way, that's a disarming one with kids. Because you're what when you're standing in front of that classroom? You're the font of all knowledge.
Yeah.
We'd like to be, right? But at some point along the way, you have to say, I don't really know. What do you think? But it's an important question to ask, given the nature of bureaucracies. Let's move a little bit further up. What about the clerk who sits in the Citizenship Office in Berlin and compiles the lists of Jews living in Munich? Is that clerk responsible? Probably more responsible than the janitor who cleans things at night, but you still can't say if it's responsible. I think it's an important question to note. And it's more than just the historical thing of this happened, this happened, this happened. Yeah.
In an instance like that, though, I would have to say it kind of depends on like if he knows what he is doing is actually contributing to the overall system. I mean, in the United States Army, we have the Abrams tank. The Abrams tank is actually parts are built all across the country. Nobody necessarily knows what the part's built for. They just know that they're doing it. So I mean, it kind of along the same lines.
Well, and I think that's the important point to note there, because as you say, when it's this part, this part, this part, bureaucracies, because of their anonymity, are safe places to be because you can always do what? In Harry Truman's words, pass the buck. Remember Harry Truman, the thing, the buck stops here? The bureaucracy provides anonymity and therefore provides safety. But it's a question you have to have students consider. And the answer is I don't know. It's one you don't get an answer to, but you really have students wrestle with that kind of question. How about the cook in a concentration camp who's preparing meals for the guards? Does that cook really have anything to do with harming the prisoners, with persecuting the prisoners? Probably not. Can the camp function without that cook? Well, you could get another cook. I mean, this is an important question with which to wrestle, and I think it emphasizes some very important things. Now, by the way, there's a lot of controversy, not so much as it used to be, about the Holocaust. Was it intentional or was it functional? Does it just happen? And there's a lot of discussion about the difference between the Holocaust and other genocides. If we were talking about the 100 days of killing in Rwanda, we wouldn't be talking about this. Why? Yeah, the systemization didn't occur. It was very, very random. It really began when that disc jockey basically said, do it. But you don't have all these other kinds of things. It's one of the things that makes the Holocaust rather unique, is the fact that you have all this kind of thing going into play. Yeah, let's go ahead.
But out of this, you get a different idea about bureaucracy, right? And
Exactly.
accountability. That anonymity is no longer something you can hide behind.
Well, no, I think that's an important point. Patty's exactly right. I think that's the important point, that you have to have kids consider this question. What is the accountability? I think you as a political scientist would agree with this. What is that accountability within that? Should people say, when that clerk is sitting there preparing that list of Jews living in Munich, should that clerk say, why is this list being prepared? Why has the government told me, and the other clerks sitting in this office with me, why has the government told us to prepare this list?
I think there could be other circumstances. In 1938, they could be doing a pre-census thing. In 1944, wow, there's something else going on here.
Sure, yeah.
And that's, it was kind of interesting because the kids aren't afraid to ask the question. We had Dr. Peter Bromfeld come in, and he was 4 years old. And so the kids asked him if he blamed the train conductor for his parents being taken away from him. And he's like, and he didn't know how to answer the question. So the kids aren't afraid to ask that question because I think what they look like in their life is, I see things happening next to me.
Exactly.
Am I a bystander or a perpetrator for not doing anything for it, which is pretty interesting.
Let me make a comment on two things Jeff just said. Number one, that's a historian who's also a survivor. I mean, think about that. The first generation of Holocaust historians were mainly survivors, at least many of them were. So think about the historian who's actually a participant in the event. That's a very unique kind of thing. The other thing, the fact that you're starting to converse among yourselves is something I think you can really encourage with doing this. And again, if you think about best learning practices, and that's a really interesting thing to do, and I encourage you to do it in your classroom too. So, yeah, but Jeff, you're exactly right. The historian survivor has to wrestle with these questions. Okay, against whom? Jews, Roma gypsies, I'll come back to that in a minute, people with disabilities, and some of the Slavic peoples. Now, these are the first four of the victim groups. We immediately have a problem up here of terminology. actually two problems of terminology. Anybody see a problem in terminology up here? Roma gypsies. What's the problem in terminology there? If we're going to be very careful about precise, correct terminology.
Should you add Sinti, Roma?
Oh, okay, Roma Sinti are the two different branches, correct. It's actually the Roman and the Roma Sinti are the branches. But what's the other problem there?
Gypsy's a derogatory term.
What's the problem with the term gypsies?
It's a derogatory
term. The Holocaust Museum has wrestled with this one, and the term gypsies is used because that's the term people know. But the correct term is Roma for two reasons. Number one, the term gypsy is derogatory. Number two, it implies that the Roma came from where?
Romania or Italy. Rome.
Well, they basically came from Romania, at least in Europe. But the term implies they came from where? Egypt. The term gypsy implies they came from Egypt, when in fact the Roma actually came from northern India. The bigger problem is it's a derogatory term. None of you will remember this, but back when I was in college or whatever, Cher had a song. Patty, you're laughing. What's the song? Gypsies, tramps, and thieves. Gypsy men were thieves, gypsy women were prostitutes. It's a very derogatory term. If you cheat somebody, you gypsum. It's a very derogatory term. Yeah, Carol.
Isn't there a problem with Jews too as a term, because so many of the people who were targeted were not practicing Jewish people, or they were of Jewish descent?
Let me come back to that one. It's an interesting point. Let me come back to that one in just a minute. Let me give you another example of this terminology thing. I have a very, very good friend of mine who is from Cincinnati. She's a retired teacher, very good, very well-known Holocaust educator. She's Reformed Jewish, and that's important to the story here. And several years ago, I was talking to her one time, and her husband's name is Saul, but he goes by Sonny. And I said, well, Ellen, I said, how's Sonny doing? Oh, he's fine, he just got a new car. What kind of car? He got whatever. He got a good deal, he Jewed the dealer down. And I said, Ellen, she said, oh my God, I never thought about it. The point being there are these terms that come into language and we have to be careful of them. So the correct term is Roma, Roma Sinti. The Roma are the Eastern Roma, and the Sinti are the Western. But we have to put the term gypsy in there. Why?
People know.
It's the term people know. Now, Carol's point about Jews is also a critical one. Because the definition of who was a Jew in Germany was an artificial definition created by the Nazi regime. How much did that definition have to do with religion? Almost none. It was based on a racial ideology, based on a completely bogus idea. Now, you want a really complicated one to explain? It was a bogus racial ideology, but they used religion as a means of defining. So religion had nothing to do with it, and yet they used religion as a starting point. Try to explain that one to a freshman in high school. Okay? People with disabilities.
And you said it was bogus racial thing, which race really had nothing to do with it either.
Yeah, the anthropologist tells us that race is an artificial social construct. And yet everything that happened in Nazi Germany was based on a racial ideology. Everything. Michael Burley, a very well-known English historian, 20 years ago wrote a book called The Racial State. Because everything that happened in Germany was based upon this bogus racial ideology. Slavic peoples would include Russians, Poles, and so forth. And they are targeted, or they are intended for annihilation or decimation. Three other groups: homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political dissidents. What particular groups of political dissidents?
Communists.
Communists and socialists, right? Exactly. Why? Because they're on the political left, and Nazism is on the political right. So I want to come in here. Hang on just a minute. There we go. So, they are not targeted for annihilation or decimation. They are targeted for oppression and death. Now, when we say oppression and death, the key idea was to control, and some of them would be killed along the way for various reasons. So those are your victim groups, yeah.
Where would somebody like the Rhineland, I hesitate to use the term, the Rhineland bastards, where
Yeah.
would they fit in?
They would be included up here for a reason we'll get to in just a minute.
Okay.
I'll come back to that in just a minute, yeah. Okay, so you got the groups there, okay? This definition has changed a little bit over the course of time, by the way. Now the question then is, why? These four groups are targeted for racial and ethnic reasons. They are defined by the Nazi regime as being racially inferior to the general German population. In German culture, in German history, there is the idea of das Volk, the people. The problem is, as you all know, when you translate from language to language, you can translate words, but it's hard to translate implications, right? So this idea of the Volk in Germany, in German culture, it's the people, but it's more than that. It's this idea of the unity of the German culture, the unity of the German mind. It's way, way back to the Middle Ages. So what Nazism said was that these groups were in one way or another a threat to the survival and the vibrancy of the Volk, of the German people. The blood unity of the German people. Use that term with some freshmen. The blood unity of the German people. Blood and soil is the phrase that they use. Now let's look at these groups. Jews are defined as being biologically inferior. And let me make a very important point here, folks. When you deal with this topic with students, and I think the people who've done this before will agree with this, you really have to say to students ahead of time, look guys, we're going to be using some very tough terminology. When you start talking about racially inferior, biologically inferior, you're expecting, you need to insist upon a certain level of maturity from your students. Because it's not an easy terminology to use. Jews, racially inferior. Roma, racially inferior. People with disabilities is different. Jews and Roma were being seen as being outside the Volk. The people with disabilities were members of the Volk who had genetic disabilities. Down syndrome, for example. And they are seen as dangerous to the Volk because of genetic imperfections, if you want to use that term. The Slavic peoples, particularly Poles and Russians, are seen as subhuman. The peoples from the East are seen as brutes. You can look at Nazi propaganda and they'll have pictures of Russians, and they depict them as very much brutish kind of characters. So these groups are picked for racial, ethnic, and national reasons. The key phrase here, once again, they are a threat to the Volk. Okay, everybody get that idea? Now here's where this becomes very, very tricky. German Jews were among the most assimilated Jews in Europe. Polish Jews were not assimilated. There was no pretense that Polish Jews were assimilated. Russian Jews were not assimilated. German Jews were assimilated. They saw themselves as being German. But racial ideology said no matter how German you pretended to be, you could never really be German. If you were born in the Volk, you were in the Volk. If you weren't born in the Volk, you weren't in it no matter what you did. Did we get the idea there? Now think about your own teaching situation. The grade level you teach, the school where you teach, etc., and think about how you would propose that topic. It's a very, very tricky topic to propose. Now, if those groups are picked for racial, ethnic, national reasons, why are these groups picked? Why are these groups picked?
Nonconformists.
Yeah, behavioral reasons, right, exactly. Political behavioral reasons. The first four groups, key phrases here, folks. The first four groups are picked because of who they were. The last three groups are picked because of, you want to finish the sentence?
What they believe.
What they did. Now let's look at these groups. Homosexuals were seen as practicing a deviant behavior, and it was seen that you could change. Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witness, the religion was started in the United States, went to Europe. There were about 30,000 witnesses in Germany in 1933. Why would they be seen as being a threat to the Nazi regime, even though they're members of the vote biologically? Because Carol?
They wouldn't take an oath of loyalty
Yeah.
to.
Yeah, they're apolitical. Jehovah's Witnesses do not take oaths, they don't not vote, they don't serve in the army, and so forth and so on.
I think
So-
they were also nonviolent.
And they're nonviolent, exactly right. Exactly, they're nonviolent. And so they are seen as being a problem because of behavior. Now here's the important point to note here. Those top four groups had no escape clause. If you were a Jew in Europe, in Germany or German-occupied Europe, you were intended to die. Same thing for the Roma. A Jehovah's Witness arrested and sent to a concentration camp was interrogated and given a document. And the document said, I renounce my faith. And if a Jehovah's Witness signed that document, he or she was released. It's called the escape clause. And almost none of them did it, by the way. So there's a big difference here with what goes on. The difference of who they were as opposed to what they did. Everybody see the distinction there? It's a critical one to note. Political dissidence the same way. If you're a communist and you're simply browbeaten into not being political anymore, you're probably released. One less person to keep in the camps. And in fact, a lot of political dissidents who were arrested in 33, 34 will be released. Many of them will go into exile. The top groups have no escape clause. The bottom groups have escape clause. Okay? That's the why. Now some pictures. Take a good look at these. And I'd like somebody to propose a theory why I chose these 6 different pictures.
Are they from 6 different victim groups?
No, actually no. They're from one victim group.
Does it show the variation with how they're identified over time?
No, but that's a good guess. By the way, you want kids to guess what you're doing. There's nothing wrong with guessing. I mean, kids are so fixated on the right answer, you can get them to guess sometimes too.
Different status?
In what way?
I would say financial.
Possibly, although we can sort of tell, but not exactly.
Shows some of the diversity within that one victim group.
Yes. And I would suggest a 5-to-1 diversity.
Shows the westernization versus the easternization of the Jewish people.
You're very close. Which shows westernization, you want to use that term?
The lower right.
The lower right. The lower right is the odd picture in here. This is where you want kids to say, oh, I can't believe he's making me think this way. Just tell me, just give me the answer.
Well, they're not wearing a star that I can see.
They're not, no, that's correct.
They're not practicing Jews?
They may be, we don't know. We don't know. But you're close.
They consider themselves Germans?
Yeah.
And the rest were...
These 2 men are obviously Orthodox Jews, probably from the East. These are people lined up going into a camp or a ghetto. These people are wearing the star. These people are what? Being put on a train, probably to a death camp. These people are moving into a ghetto. This is a German Jewish family on the street And if I didn't tell you they were Jewish, what?
You wouldn't know.
You wouldn't know. This is an assimilated German Jewish family that considers itself, key phrase here, Germans who happen to be Jews. What happens is the Nazi regime redefines them as Jews who are pretending to be Germans. So the key thing here, when we get back to this idea, is to emphasize the fact, and Carol sort of suggested this a few minutes ago, that even to use the term Jews as a monolithic thing is incorrect. Okay, everybody get the idea there? Some more pictures now. The bottom picture is in a Roma camp. There were, in Auschwitz, for example, there was a Roma camp within Auschwitz-Birkenau. The picture of the killing of the disabilities, the T4 program. The building in the background is a medical institution in a town called Hadamar. It was one of the 7 killing centers for the T4 program of euthanasia. The building is still, by the way, used as a medical clinic. And this is displayed from it in the Holocaust Museum. A Polish political prisoner. The P denotes Pole. And down here it says KZ Flossenburg, which is one of the political camps. I'll get the camps here in just a minute. This is a drawing of a pamphlet on the persecution of the homosexuals. The purple triangles, each victim group had a symbol, and the Jehovah's Witnesses always used the purple triangle. There's a very interesting film by that title, by the way. Anybody want to guess who these people are? You see okay? You see okay?
I would guess POWs.
Yeah, they're Soviet POWs who were being subjected to medical experimentation, starvation experimentation in one of the camps, Soviets, Slavic peoples. How about this group?
Can you be more specific? Which group? Are you talking about the citizens or?
Yeah, in other words, who do you think these fellows are on the right?
Political prisoners.
Yeah, they're political dissidents, probably socialists or communists. This picture was taken early, probably 34, 35. Now, imagine, if you will, that the left-hand part of that picture was cut off, and all those people in uniform are not in there. Is there anything in that picture that denotes they're in a concentration camp other than maybe the fact they're standing there very rigidly? How are they dressed? Business suits. They don't appear to be maltreated or anything like that. So again, this illustrates the diversity, if you will, within the victim groups. There is no question something's happening to these men. Other than, again, if you ignore the left-hand side there, they're standing in line for someplace, but they don't appear to be particularly mistreated. Again, this was early on. This was in 34, 35. I believe it was in Sachsenhausen, which is a camp just north of Berlin. Still there, you can visit it. So again, these distinctions within the victim groups are very, very important to note. Using the exercise. I would hope that some of the things we've talked about today clear up some inaccuracies in your mind. Assumptions. The complex nature of the event. Again, we haven't answered that question. We've said how it happened, the systematic bureaucratic process, but if we said the how, how did it happen? How did the most sophisticated country in Europe buy into this? Is a very important question. Because Germany was, prior to the Holocaust, particularly prior to World War I, Germany was the center of world learning. If you were a young American doctor in 1890 and you wanted to have that extra tagline on your resume, medical doctor, what did you do? You want to guess?
In Germany.
You went for your postgraduate medical training in Germany. Finest university system in the world, finest medical system in the world, first system of what we would today call Social Security in the world. And yet, where does it happen? That's the how question that we can't answer very well. So, definition. And I would tell you there, and again, don't try to copy it down. The Holocaust Museum has had two different definitions. They've sort of revised it over the course of time. This is the second one. And we'll give you a sheet here in just a minute that has 4 definitions on it. The original Holocaust Museum definition, a revised definition, a definition from the Imperial War Museum in London, and a definition from Yad Vashem in Israel. Now, why do you suppose we would give you definitions from the US, Israel, and UK? It emphasizes something about history that students really need to understand.
Perspective.
Perspective. History is always written from a perspective. I've got a book at home I found in a used bookstore a long time ago, and 2 American historians collected textbooks from all over the world, had them translated, and then published this textbook. And what it will have, it will be a particular topic, and the American treatment of that in an American textbook, and a treatment of that in the textbook of the other country. For example, there is a section in there on the Cuban Missile Crisis. A US textbook, a Cuban textbook, and a Soviet textbook. Anybody want to guess something about those 3 articles?
They're exactly the same.
They're exactly the same, right. And that man can buy some Florida swampland. Now think about that. So one of the things I think it's important to note, and you can emphasize this with students just by looking at the definitions. America is looking at the Holocaust as an event that happened someplace else. Israel is talking about the Holocaust in what way? An event that happened to us, if you want to use this term. England was talking about it in terms of Churchill's desire at the end of the war to do what? Keep the British Empire going. So you have 3 very, very different perspectives. And I think that even giving that idea to students is important. So let's look at it here. Yeah, don't try to copy it. We've got it printed for you. Look at the key words again. Systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored. Approximately 6 million Jews. The number is really about 5.4 million. Don't get hung up on numbers, by the way. You notice we're an hour into the program here, an hour and a half, and it's the first time we mentioned the number. It's also the last time we'll mention the number. It gives the meaning of the word Holocaust. The Israelis prefer the word Shoah. It has religious implications. It has the terms racially superior and racially inferior. Critical terms to use. What's the problem with using the term racial in this context, folks? Josh, you teach in an urban school.
You automatically assume that you're talking the races as people see them here.
The word race in an American classroom is a loaded word. We all know that. Particularly in urban schools. That's why I picked on Josh, because he's in an urban school. And even in a rural school, it's a loaded word. And so you have to really make sure students understand what you're discussing here. The second paragraph, it identifies groups as being racially inferior or groups targeted for behavioral political reasons. Now look back at your own definitions for just a moment, then we'll take a break here. We're about 5 minutes behind, not too bad. And sort of answer in your own mind, how many of these did I have in one form or another? What do I have in my definition that was incorrect? Where did I really hit the target and have a good perspective? Those of you who used the word system, how many of you had the word systematic in your definition? Give yourself an A for the morning. Not for the day, just for the morning, by the way. We're working on this. How many of you, or would any of you volunteer, put you on the spot here, would any of you volunteer something you had in your definition that you now know to be incorrect or inaccurate? Very quiet, very sudden.
I don't know about inaccurate, but I specifically mentioned the Nazi regime and nothing about collaborators.
Okay. Yeah, it's fair enough. That's just kind of an extension kind of thing. Anybody else?
I didn't go back far enough on the dates.
Okay, the date, and that's kind of an iffy one. Again, the historians debated it, 35, 38, that's kind of an iffy one. again, Carol suggested might be, or somebody suggested might be, the writing of Mein Kampf in 24, 25. That's kind of, anybody else?
One of the things that we kind of touched on was for those I would say what they did for
Okay.
was rehabilitation or reform.
Yeah. It wasn't so much rehabilitation as quieting down, for lack of a better term. In other words, if you were a socialist or communist from the political left, there wasn't the idea that you would go through the camp and come out a Nazi. I'll explain the difference between fascism and Nazism in a minute. The idea was that you're going to keep your mouth shut. I mean, that was the whole idea. So what happens is the political dissidents were arrested. They would be held for very different parts of time. When the camp authorities, if you will, were convinced that they were no longer a threat, they were released. Many of them went into political exile. Many of them went to England, the U.S. if they could, other places, South America, whatever. The ones who stayed in Germany were watched. But the idea was, in many cases, they'd been broken psychologically. They're no longer a threat. Same way with the witnesses. The witness who was released, again, none of them, very, very few of them were. Actually, about 7,000 witnesses were executed. And interesting enough, by beheading. It's kind of an interesting deal there. But it wasn't so much rehabilitation as we can keep you from being a problem.
One of the things that, there's a packet of reading that the kids do, and it mentioned African Americans.
Yes, okay, and somebody asked about the Rhineland bastards, yeah.
Is that, okay, that's what.
Yeah.
So were those African Americans that married German
Yeah, what
people?
happened was that at the end of World War I, if you go back to your World War I history, and I'll come back and make another reference in just a minute, the French stationed troops in the Rhineland. The Rhineland is the area between the Rhine River and the French border. It was part of the Versailles Treaty business. And many of the troops that the French stationed in that area were Africans from the French Empire. And as happens when military occupations occur, affairs occur. So there were a couple of thousand children born in the Rhineland area of Germany in the 1920s of German women and these African soldiers from the French Empire. They're known as the Rhineland bastards. When the T4 euthanasia program came along and the persecutions came along, the Nazi authorities really had a problem with this, because on the one hand they had German mothers, but on the other hand they had these African fathers. And so what they determined to do was they sterilized them. And there's still a very few of these people are still alive. They'd be in their mid-90s now. Again, there were about 2,000 of them. And so that's what happened. They were sterilized.
But they weren't killed?
No, there were very few cases they were killed.
One thing too that is interesting is that it's the only group of people that the Nazis the German people actually minted coins in reference to these people.
Yeah.
You can actually look them up. They're pretty
It's
pretty
an
interesting.
interesting circumstance. And some people say, why aren't they included in the definition? I think because it's a very, very small group. And I'm not sure. You'd have to go back and ask when the definition was being put together. I will tell you when the definition was originally put together, there was a lot of controversy about it, particularly the idea of including the Poles. Because there's this big controversy about Polish complicity. This is a huge issue. It's a huge issue in Poland. Every once in a while you'll see a reference to Polish death camps. And the Polish government just is, they just hate that term. It's a really controversial term. And when I was in Poland in 2009 with a teacher group over there, from the museum we went over there, and we got into this debate with some Polish educators about how they should be referred. And finally somebody said, well, how about if we say German death camps in Poland? And the lead teacher said, no, that's not right. And somebody said, why? He says, it's German death camps in occupied Poland, the key word being the word occupied. So that's a really controversial issue. The whole idea of Polish complicity is a really complicated one. On the one hand, were the Poles anti-Semitic? Yes, the most anti-Semitic place in Europe, probably. Did the Poles do much to help the Jews? No. Could they have done much? Probably not, when you look at the circumstance. And yet there's this overriding issue with that that's a really, really critical issue. Again, with the Polish government, with Polish educational authorities. And a lot of it has to do with the very tenuous relationship that Poland has always had with Germany. You know, and this is in regard to the Holocaust, but to explain that a little bit, when the wall came down in November of 1989, obviously, that's next week, it's actually the end of this week is when the wall came down. A few days later, in the West German parliament in Bonn at that time, a West German member of the parliament went up to the speaking thing and said, now that the wall came down, it's time to talk about the Polish border question. And Helmut Kohl, the chancellor, rushed up and said, no, there is no such thing as the Polish border question. Because whenever the Polish border question was raised in Europe, what did you have? A war. So, I mean, it's a really touchy issue when you look at the fact that much of what used to be Prussia is now Poland. So it's a very, very touchy issue in Poland, the whole idea of Polish complicity or non-complicity in the Holocaust. Patty?
I just want to say it's interesting that even if these other groups weren't included in the Holocaust definition, they do all then get incorporated in the genocide definition.
Yeah, exactly.
And so ideas of sterilization, that is an aspect of genocide, and that's an international criminal law.
The original definition that Raphael Lemkin had of genocide was the murder of the Jews. The definition now has, what, 5 parts, Patty, or something like that? There are 5 different actions that can be termed genocide.
And same for refugees. They
And
were
same
all,
for
they were all
refugees,
defined specifically for the Holocaust,
Yeah.
often with time. So for a refugee,
Yeah.
it was anything before 1945,
Right.
and then they had to alter the definition to make it work.
And it's obviously expanded. But again, the formal definition of genocide has 5 things, and the mass murder is the first one, the most important one, but one of them simply cultural separation, I think, is one, and
sterilization
of particular groups, and that. So it's a complicated issue, and I hope you see from the definition that it's a complicated issue. Any quick questions before we take a break? What we'll do, we'll hand out 3 things. We have the question sheet, if we need more copies. We have the definitions. And then there's an article I wrote that was published in the Social Studies magazine a few years ago about using this lesson in your classroom, and we've got copies of that. The only distinction being that that lesson uses the old definition rather than the new one. The 2 definitions are pretty close. It's 1 big paragraph instead of 2, but other than that, it's pretty close. So there's an article there that you can use